October 14th, 1943, 02:17 a.m. The black, heaving expanse of the North Atlantic, 200 miles west of the Faroe Islands. A slick of cold brine sluices across the bridge of U-448 as she rests just below the surface, her conning tower a dark, wet metal fist against the star-strewn void. Oberleutnant Suzy Helmut Richert, the U-boat's commander, feels the vibration of the twin diesel engines through the soles of his leather boots, a steady, powerful heartbeat. The air smells of salt, diesel fumes, and damp wool. He scans the horizon, his eyes adjusted to the profound darkness, seeing nothing but the faint, phosphorescent curl of the waves. Below him, in the red-lit control room, the atmosphere is thick with the smell of sweat, cured sausage, and the faint, ever-present tang of battery acid. 46 men, a single organism, breathing the same recycled air. They are the hunters. And for the past 4 years of this war, they have known the rules of the hunt. Suddenly, a strident cry from the sound man, his headphones clamped to his ears, his body rigid. Feindliche Zerstörer! Bearing 280, high RPM, closing fast! The mood shifts in an instant, the languid certainty evaporates. Richard barks orders, his voice cutting through the hum of machinery. Alarm! Dive! Dive! Take her down to 120 meters, rig for silent running. The metallic clang of the hatch slamming shut, the hiss of high-pressure air forcing ballast tanks to drink the sea, the angle of the deck tilting downward. It's a well-rehearsed ballet of survival. Soon, the world outside the pressure hull is absolute blackness. The electric motors whine softly, a ghostly hum. The only other sounds are the creak of the hull against the immense pressure and the ragged breathing of men trying to be silent. They are a steel whale, hiding in the deep. This is the game they know. They have played it a dozen times before. Then they hear it. The sound they have been waiting for. The sound that defines this underwater duel. The distant rhythmic pings of the enemy destroyer's Azdic, its active sonar. Ping, ping, ping. Each one is a cold electronic finger, tapping on their steel coffin, searching, probing. The crew knows the sequence. The pings will get faster, more precise. Then they will stop. That silence will be the most terrifying sound of all, for it means the destroyer has committed to its run, and the depth charges are on their way.
They brace themselves. They know the drill. They know the enemy must pass almost directly overhead. They know the charges will be set to explode at a specific depth. They know the sequence, the splash of the barrels hitting the water from the destroyer's stern, the long, agonizing wait, and then the world-shattering crump of the detonations. Deafening, concussive hammers that smash the lights, buckle plates, and rupture eardrums. But they are survivable. A near miss is chaos and terror, but it is not necessarily death. The water absorbs and disperses the blast. A boat could be shaken to its bolts, take on water, and still limp away, if her crew was skilled and her hull was sound. Rickert stands rigid in the control room, his hand resting on a cold pipe, feeling for the vibrations. He listens to the pings. The destroyer is turning. Its screws are getting louder, a high-speed thrash that fills the hydrophones. This is it, the run. But something is wrong. The pings don't stop. The destroyer isn't slowing to lay its charges. It's maintaining speed. It's not coming for a classic stern run. It's holding its course but adjusting. It's coming straight for them but not overhead. It's stopping at a distance. The soundman looks up, his face a mask of confusion in the red light. Her Kalu, he is holding position 700 meters ahead. The pings are constant. Rickert frowns. This is not the script. This is not how the dance is performed. A cold knot of uncertainty tightens in his gut. What are they doing? What new move is this? Then from the hydrophones, a new sound. Not the splash of heavy barrels, not the whine of a new weapon being deployed. It is a series of smaller, sharper, almost delicate plinks. A cluster of them, hitting the water somewhere ahead and above, like stones being skipped by a giant. Silence follows. No explosions, no world-ending detonations, just silence. The crew of U-448 holds its breath, straining to hear. The only sound is the frantic, unanswered ping, ping, ping of the Aztec. The depth charges, their old, brutal, predictable nemesis, have not come. Something else has. And in the nerve-shredding quiet, a new kind of fear, cold and unfamiliar, begins to seep into the boat.
The silence was the weapon. In the control room of U-448, the absence of sound was more deafening than any explosion. Seconds stretched into a small eternity. Men exchanged glances, their eyes wide with unspoken questions. What was that? A misfire? A new type of sonar buoy? The logical part of their minds scrambled for an explanation, but the primal part, the part that lived in the gut, screamed that this was wrong, profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. Oberleutnant Richard's mind raced, replaying the acoustic signature. Plink, 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 plink. A pattern. It hadn't been random. It was a salvo, a calculated dispersal. He looked at the sound man, whose face was still pressed into his headphones. Report. Anything. Anything at all. Nothing, Herr Kalu. Only the destroyer's screws and the ASDIC. The objects. They entered the water and nothing. On the deck of His Majesty's ship Orwell, the atmosphere was one of intense, focused anticipation. The Hedgehog, its spigot mortar assembly looking like a bizarre, multi-barreled pipe organ, had just unleashed its 24 projectiles. Each 65-pound bomb, filled with Torpex high explosive, had arced through the night air in a graceful, spreading ellipse, landing in a circular pattern roughly 250 feet in diameter ahead of the ship's bow. The principle was brutal in its simplicity. Where depth charges created a large area of probability, the Hedgehog created a precise killing zone. It was a mathematical solution to the problem of a submerged U-boat. Unlike the depth charge, which used a hydrostatic pistol set to explode at a predetermined depth, the Hedgehog's bomb was fitted with a contact pistol. It would only detonate if it physically struck the hard steel of the U-boat's pressure hull. A miss was silent. A miss told the U-boat crew nothing. It denied them the critical auditory data they relied on to plot their escape. The splashes marking the start of the attack run. The explosions revealing the destroyer's depth settings and position. Down below, the crew of U-448 was blind and deaf in a new way. The classic depth charge attack was a violent storm. You could feel its direction, its intensity, and you could maneuver between its thunderclaps. This was different. This was a trap that had already been sprung. The charges were already in the water, sinking at a rate that meant they would reach the U-boat's depth in mere moments. They were sinking now, silent, invisible, a constellation of death descending upon them from above. Rickard had to make a decision. Instinct, honed by a dozen previous depth charge engagements, screamed at him to turn, to run, to go deep. But to do what? Where was the threat? The plinks had been ahead. The destroyer was still there, pinging. Was this a prelude to a standard attack? Was it a trick? Helm hard to port, all ahead full. Take her down to 180 meters, he commanded, his voice sharper than he intended. The electric motors whined in protest as the rudder bit into the water. The boat began to swing, its nose tilting further downward. The game was the same, present a moving target, but for the first time, he felt he was playing against a hidden hand. On the Orwell, the ASDIC operator listened, his face a mask of concentration. The ping, ping, ping echoed through the ship's speaker. He was tracking the U-boat's turn, its dive. He calculated the sinking rate of the Hedgehog bombs, the estimated position of the target. The lieutenant commander on the bridge watched the silent dark water ahead, his knuckles white on the railing. There would be no great plumes of water, no thunderous roar to signal a hit. The only confirmation would be... Aboard U-448, they felt it before they heard it. A violent, jarring clang of metal on metal directly forward. It was the sound of something heavy and solid striking the outer hull near the bow. It was not an explosion. It was a knock. A death knell. In that frozen fraction of a second, every man in the forward torpedo room looked up. They had time to process the sound, to understand its meaning. It was a direct hit. The trigger had been pressed. And then the world ended. The first bomb's contact fuse completed its electrical circuit. The Torpex detonated. The instantaneous, shaped explosion tore a massive hole in the forward hull. But the horror was just beginning. The Hedgehog was designed for this, for a phenomenon the Germans would come to call the Tiefendetonation, the underwater chain reaction. The single shattering explosion did not just rip open the boat, it created a massive instantaneous cavity in the water. This collapse of the blast cavity created a shock wave that, in the dense medium of water, traveled with brutal efficiency. It set off the other 23 bombs sinking through the same kill zone. The sea around U-448 did not explode. It erupted. A coordinated, simultaneous detonation of nearly 1,500 pounds of high explosive hammered the submarine from a dozen different points at once. The pressure hull, designed to withstand the immense, uniform squeeze of the deep, was utterly defenseless against this localized, cataclysmic overpressure. It was like an eggshell being struck by a dozen sledgehammers. There was no time for a second thought, no time for a final prayer. The forward 3/4 of U-448 were simply pulverized into a cloud of shredded steel, machinery, and human flesh. The violent inrush of thousands of tons of freezing Atlantic water sealed the tomb of the aft section, dragging it and the few men still alive there down into the crushing darkness. On the surface, the crew of the Orwell saw nothing but a faint, luminescent shudder deep beneath the waves. A split second later, a low, muffled thump reverberated through their own hull, a deep, organic sound that was felt in the bones more than heard by the ears. Then a great boil of air, oil, and debris churned the surface into a white foam. The ASDIC operator listened. The ping, ping, ping went unanswered. There was only the hollow hiss of the open ocean. The target was gone.
The silence returned, but this time it was absolute. Aboard the Orwell, the initial thrill of a confirmed kill was cold, professional, and brief. They had a job to do. A signal was encoded and sent to Group Command. U-boat sighted and attacked. Hedgehog attack. Result: sunk. Oil and debris sighted. There was no cheering, only a grim satisfaction. They had perfected a new equation of warfare. Precision plus surprise equals annihilation. But for the Kriegsmarine, the silence that followed the loss of U-448 and others like her was a void, filled with a dawning, chilling terror. The U-boat service was a brotherhood bound by shared experience and shared danger. They passed on knowledge in the smoky bars of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, tactics, evasion techniques, the psychological profile of their hunters. They had codified the dance with the destroyers. They knew the steps. Now, the music had changed, and they didn't know the tune. The first fragmented reports trickled back from patrols. They were patchy, confused, because there were often no survivors to report anything at all. A U-boat would send a routine status update, and then nothing. Vanished. No final frantic radio message about a depth charging. No wreckage found by later patrols. They were simply erased. When a U-boat did manage to survive a Hedgehog attack, through sheer luck, a last-second maneuver, or a misfire in the new system, the debriefings were frantic. The commander spoke of an attack with no warning, no splashes, no running. The destroyer would simply stop at a distance, and then a strange, quiet plinking sound, and then, for those who were missed, an unnerving, inexplicable silence. They hadn't been shaken, they had been ignored. And then the hunter would often make a second, identical, silent run. The psychological impact was devastating. Depth charges were a test of endurance. You could hear them coming, you could count them, you could feel the blasts recede, you could fight. The Hedgehog was a verdict. It was a judge pronouncing a sentence of death that was already in motion before you even knew you were on trial. There was no fighting it. There was only the wait and the hope that the invisible sinking constellation of death would miss your tiny patch of black ocean. For the crew, the stress became unbearable. With depth charges, the terror was acute, a series of violent crescendos followed by moments of respite where men could gasp, check for damage, and plot their next move. With the Hedgehog, the terror was a sustained, high-pitched note of anxiety. The moment the plinks were heard, every man was frozen, waiting for the single, definitive clang that would be the last sound they ever heard. It turned the U-boat, their steel sanctuary, into a potential tomb in a way the depth charge never could. A depth charge rattled the boat. The Hedgehog promised to uncreate it.
In the wolf packs, a new superstition was born. They called the unseen weapon the eagle, the hedgehog. The name sounded almost quaint, but the fear it carried was not. A commander's reputation began to hinge not just on his tonnage sunk, but on his encounters with the silent killer. To have been hunted by a hedgehog-equipped escort group and lived was a mark of divine favor or incredible luck. Grand Admiral Donitz's staff in Berlin pored over the limited data. They understood the basic principle from captured documents and intelligence scraps. A forward-throwing weapon with contact fuses. The tactical implications were horrifying. It negated the U-boat's primary defense, diving deep and maneuvering erratically after the depth charge splashes were heard. Now the first sign of an attack was the attack itself. The hunter had been given a rifle to replace its bludgeon. The happy time, the period of unchecked U-boat dominance in the early war, was a fading memory. The Atlantic had become a killing field, and the U-boats were no longer the only apex predators. A new, more efficient killer was stalking the gray waves, one that killed without thunder, without warning, and with a finality that left no room for heroes' tales. The men of the U-boat arm, once the fearless knights of the deep, now listened to the hydrophones with a new, more primal kind of fear. They were no longer just hunting or being hunted. They were waiting for a silent, invisible scythe to fall from the darkness above. March 2nd, 1944. The Kriegsmarine's Experimental Command, Guttenhafen. Korvettenkapitän Erich Miller did not look like a man on the cutting edge of weapons development. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, which was largely true. The charts and schematics spread across the oak table in front of him were not plans for a new offensive marvel, but for a last-ditch effort at survival. The scent of stale coffee and anxiety hung heavy in the room. The acoustic data from U-305's last patrol is inconclusive, a junior engineer offered, his voice tentative. They reported the Eagle attack, evaded, but their hydrophone was damaged in the maneuver. We have no clear signature of the projectile's entry into the water. Miller slammed his fist on the table, the sharp crack making the other men jump. Inconclusive? Evaded? This is the language of our defeat. We are not dealing with a mystery anymore. We are dealing with a physical weapon. It is launched, it sinks, it explodes on contact. We must find a physical counter. This was the heart of the German dilemma. The Hedgehog was not a complex piece of electronic wizardry to be jammed or deciphered. It was brutally, elegantly simple. Its genius was in its redefinition of the battle space. The Allies had moved the kill zone from the destroyer's stern, where a U-boat could see and hear the attack develop, to a point hundreds of yards ahead of the bow, a void of silent, impending doom. The German response was a frantic scramble, a series of desperate countermoves born of this new, terrifying calculus. The first and most obvious solution was to never be found in the first place. The development of the Schnorchel, a retractable breathing tube that allowed a U-boat to run its diesel engines while submerged, was accelerated with frantic urgency. It was a marvel of engineering, but a miserable piece of equipment for the crew. It was prone to valve failure, which could either suck the air out of the boat or flood it with seawater. In heavy seas, it would often shut automatically, causing the diesel engines to gasp vast quantities of the boat's internal air, creating a vacuum that felt like having your eardrums ripped out. But it kept them hidden from the prying eyes of aircraft and the surface lookouts of the Hedgehog-armed escorts. Yet, it was not enough. A skilled Aztec operator could still find a Schnorkel-equipped boat in calm seas. They had to fight back.
So they turned to deception. The Pillenwerfer, the pill thrower, was deployed with renewed vigor. This device ejected chemical pellets that, upon contact with water, created a vast, swirling cloud of artificial bubbles. The cloud would return a sonar echo, a false target, a phantom U-boat meant to distract the hunter and hopefully absorb a Hedgehog salvo. It was a clever trick, a magician's sleight of hand in the deep, but it was a delaying tactic, not a solution. A skilled escort commander would simply saturate the area, knowing the real boat was nearby. Then came the more aggressive, more dangerous ideas. Engineers proposed Aphrodite, a radical decoy system involving a large hydrogen-filled balloon tethered to a cable and float. The idea was to create a massive, lingering sonar target that would hopefully lure in a Hedgehog attack. It was cumbersome, unreliable, and in the end, another desperate gambit that treated the symptom, not the disease. The disease was the Hedgehog's precision, and so the search began for a true hard-kill countermeasure. Designs were drafted for upward-firing mortars, for mine-laying systems to be deployed in a patrol boat's path. But the U-boat was a fragile instrument of attack, not a fortified defensive position. There was no room, no weight allowance, and no time to turn it into one. The chilling realization, the one that settled over the Gotenhofen command like a shroud, was that there was no perfect technological answer. The Hedgehog had fundamentally broken their tactical model. The U-boat's greatest strength had been its stealth, its ability to strike from the deep and then disappear. Now, when it was found, its disappearance was no longer guaranteed. The hunter had been given a weapon that killed in the first few seconds of contact, denying the prey any chance to use its evasive skills. The engineers and tacticians filed out of the room, their heads bowed in thought. Mueller remained, staring at the schematics until the lines blurred. The counter-moves they were devising were the twitches of a wounded animal, not the calculated parries of a master fencer. They were adding armor to a boxer who was now being shot from across the street. The rules of the ring no longer applied. He looked out the window at the gray Baltic Sea.
Somewhere, out in the vast, storm-tossed Atlantic, his U-boats were fighting and dying under a new, silent law of war. They were no longer just submarines. They were targets in a shooting gallery, waiting for the salvo they would never hear coming.
May 7th, 1945. The Firth of Forth, Scotland. The grey light of a Scottish dawn bled over a silent, heart-breaking armada. One by one, like vanquished sea monsters, the U-boats of the Kriegsmarine surfaced and entered the estuary under the watchful guns of the Royal Navy. They flew the black surrender flag, a pathetic, fluttering symbol of absolute defeat. On the deck of U-2321, a brand-new Type 21 electroboat, the most advanced submarine in the world, Kapitan Lieutenant Karl Brandt stood rigid, his hands clenched behind his back. The air no longer smelled of diesel and salt spray, but of humiliation and coal smoke. He watched as his crew, pale and hollow-eyed, lined up on deck, their gazes fixed on the victorious British destroyers shepherding them to internment. They had never been defeated in a fair fight. Their revolutionary boat, capable of submerged speeds and endurance that would have made it a ghost a year earlier, had been rendered irrelevant before it could even fire a torpedo in anger. His mind drifted back, not to a battle, but to a conversation in a bunker in Bergen, weeks before the surrender. They had been sharing a bottle of synthetic gin with the commander of a weathered Type 7, a man with the eyes of an old man in a young face. "They call it the Eagle," the veteran had slurred, his voice a low rasp. "You do not hear it. That is the worst of it. With the depth charges, you are a man in a brawl. You are punched, you are kicked, you bleed, but you are fighting. With the Eagle, you are a patient on an operating table. The surgeon has already made the incision before the anesthetic has worn off. You only realize it when you feel the cold inside you." Brandt had dismissed it at the time as the ramblings of a broken man. His new Type 21 could outrun any escort, hide deeper and quieter. It was the future. But the future had arrived too late. The infrastructure to build them had been bombed to rubble. The trained crews were dead at the bottom of the Atlantic. The Allies hadn't just built a better weapon, they had built a better system, a vast, industrialized killing machine of which the Hedgehog was only one terrifying, efficient cog. Now, as his boat was boarded by stoic British sailors, Brandt understood. The Hedgehog was more than a mortar. It was a symbol. It represented a shift from brute force to cold clinical efficiency. It was the embodiment of Allied material and intellectual superiority. They had not only matched the U-boat threat, they had outthought it. They had turned the hunter into the prey by redesigning the very nature of the hunt.
A young Royal Navy lieutenant, crisp and confident, approached him. "Your logbooks, Captain, and your attack reports if you have them." Brandt handed over the metal case containing his war. He looked at the lieutenant, a man who had likely never known the gut clench of a depth charge run, let alone the silent, waiting terror of the Hedgehog. "Your Hedgehog," Brandt said, the English word feeling foreign and sharp on his tongue. "It is a clever weapon." The lieutenant gave a curt, professional nod. It got the job done. The understatement was colossal. It got the job done. It had helped break the back of the most feared naval force in the European theater. It had saved countless tons of Allied shipping and thousands of lives. It had terrorized the terrors of the deep. As Brandt was led away, he took one last look at his magnificent, useless submarine. The silence that had once been the U-boat's greatest ally had been turned against them. In the end, it was the silence of the Hedgehog's descent that echoed loudest in the memories of the few who had heard it and lived. It was the sound of a war being won, not just with courage, but with a ruthless, brilliant, and utterly terrifying new kind of logic.
The duel for the Atlantic was over, and the weapon that attacked from above, in silence, had written its final, decisive chapter.